Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going on a deep dive into the world of antibiotics and the bacteria they target. And we're going to be using a really neat Dutch chart as our guide. It's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, it's kind of like a cheat sheet for figuring out which antibiotic is going to work best against a certain bacteria. Of course, it's, simplified, but it's still super helpful for getting the bigger picture, of antibiotic treatment.
I bet this is especially useful for our microbiologist listeners out there.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But even if you're not a hardcore microbiologist, just understanding this chart can help you understand how antibiotics work and why it's important to use them carefully.
Okay, so let's break down this chart a little. We got a list of antibiotics down one side and then all these different bacteria across the top, and then these shaded bars connecting them. What's up with those?
So the shading, it shows how effective each antibiotic is against that particular bacteria. Like darker shade, that means there's a higher chance it'll work. And then lighter shade, that might mean it's resistant or just not as effective. So it's like a visual representation of the antibiotic spectrum.
Okay, cool. So let's start with the antibiotics. We've got some familiar names here like penicillin, amoxicillin. But then there are some that sound a little more intense, like ciprofloxacin and vancomycin. What can you tell us about those?
Yeah, sure. So penicillin and amoxicillin, they're both what we call beta-lactam antibiotics, meaning they work by targeting the peptidoglycan layer in bacterial cell walls. And that layer is like essential for bacteria to survive. When you mess with that, they can't hold their shape, they can't, stay together, and they die.
Oh, so they're like tiny demolition crews tearing down those bacterial walls.
Exactly. And penicillin, when that was discovered, total game changer. Still effective against a lot of gram-positive bacteria like, strep throat, ear infections. Amoxicillin, that's got a broader spectrum of activity, so it can target a wider range of bacteria. Makes it useful for stuff like respiratory infections, UTIs.
Okay, so that makes sense. So what about ciprofloxacin? That one sounds a bit more, I don't know, hardcore.
Yeah, so ciprofloxacin, that belongs to a group called fluoroquinolones. These guys work by inhibiting bacterial DNA replication. So basically, they stop the bacteria from multiplying. And that helps control the infection.
So instead of demolition, it's more like population control.
Exactly. And ciprofloxacin, it's used for, more serious infections like pneumonia, some types of UTIs. But it's important to remember it can have some pretty serious side effects. So doctors are careful with it.
Yeah, that's a good point. It reminds us that antibiotics are powerful drugs. We got to use them responsibly. What about vancomycin? I feel like I've heard that one mentioned in hospitals a lot.
Yeah, vancomycin. That's often used as a last resort for treating infections caused by multi-drug resistant bacteria, especially MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus.
Oh, the superbug we hear about in the news.
That's the one. A lot of common antibiotics just don't work on MRSA, which makes it really tough to treat. But vancomycin, it works differently than penicillin, so it can still be effective against MRSA.
So it's like a secret weapon.
Yeah.
When other antibiotics fail, is there a reason why it's not used more often if it's that powerful?
Well, vancomycin can have some pretty serious side effects too, like kidney damage, hearing loss. So doctors, they usually save it for the really tough cases when other options haven't worked.
That makes sense. It's like a high-risk, high-reward kind of antibiotic.
Precisely. It's a powerful tool, but you got to be careful with it.
Okay, so we've talked about those four. What about some of the other antibiotics on this chart?
Okay, well, we have a bunch of other beta-lactams. Each one's kind of its own strengths and weaknesses, like piperacillin tazobactam, or pip-tazo for short. That's a broad-spectrum antibiotic. Works against a wide range of bacteria, gram-positive and gram-negative.
So it's like the all-rounder of the antibiotic world?
You could say that, but even pip-tazo, it has its limits. Some bacteria, like Enterococcus, they've developed ways to resist that class of antibiotics.
So even the all-rounders can get outsmarted sometimes. It's like a constant back and forth between the antibiotics and the bacteria.
Exactly. Bacteria are incredibly adaptable. They're always evolving, finding new ways to survive. That's why we have to use antibiotics responsibly and keep researching new ways to combat resistance. Stay ahead of the game.
Okay, so pip-tazo, got it. What about cefazolone? Seems to have a more limited range of effectiveness, looking at the chart.
Yeah, cefazolin, that's a first-generation cephalosporin, another type of beta-lactam. It's often used for, surgical prophylaxis, skin infections, mostly targets gram-positive bacteria, Staphylococcus, Streptococcus, that narrower spectrum. It's because it's susceptible to certain bacterial enzymes that can break it down.
Those sneaky enzymes are at it again. It's like a microscopic arms race, isn't it?
Really is. Bacteria have all sorts of ways to resist antibiotics. Producing those enzymes, just one of their tricks.
So how do we stay ahead in this arms race? Any clever strategies to combat those pesky enzymes?
One strategy is to combine antibiotics with something called a beta-lactamase inhibitor. Like we have amoxicillin clavulinate on the chart. That's a combination of amoxicillin, which is broad spectrum, with clavulinate, which is that inhibitor.
So it's like sending in a double agent to disarm the enemy before the main attack.
Haha, that's a great analogy. By combining those two, you basically boost amoxicillin's effectiveness against bacteria that would normally resist it.
Pretty clever. It's amazing how scientists keep finding new ways to fight back against those always evolving bacteria. Okay, what else have we got on this chart? I see gentamicin and tobramycin. Are those related?
Yeah, those two are buddies. Both aminoglycoside antibiotics. They work by messing with protein synthesis in bacteria. They've got similar activity, effective against both gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria.
So it's like a 1-2 punch against a wide range of bacteria.
Yeah, you could put it that way. They're good for treating serious infections, but they also have the potential for pretty serious side effects, like kidney damage and hearing loss. So, they're used with caution.
Okay, so those are the heavy hitters of the antibiotic world. Powerful, but with potential risks.
That's one way to think about it.
I also see metronidazole on this chart. It seems to be kind of a specialist, mainly targeting H. influenza.
You're right. Metronidazole is a bit unique. Works against anaerobic bacteria and some parasites by disrupting their DNA synthesis. H. influenza is a common target for it, especially for respiratory tract infections.
Oh, so it's like a sniper, targeting a specific enemy. And finally, we have trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole, or COT, as it's abbreviated here. What's the deal with that one?
Oh, CPT. It's a combination antibiotic, works by inhibiting different steps in the bacterial folate synthesis pathway, and folate. That's essential for bacterial growth. So by blocking its production, you're essentially killing the bacteria. Used a lot for UTIs, skin infections, some types of pneumonia.
Wow, that's wild. It's like cutting off the enemy supply lines.
No.
So we've covered all the antibiotics on this chart. Now let's move on to the bacteria, shall we?
All right, so bacteria. Let's start with some of the most common ones, the ones that cause, infections in humans, like E. coli.
E. coli. Notorious food poisoning culprit, but it can cause other infections too.
Right, yeah, for sure. See, most strains of E. coli, they're harmless. Actually, they live in our intestines peacefully, part of the, gut flora and all that. But some strains, those can cause, those nasty foodborne illnesses, UTIs, even more serious stuff like meningitis.
So it's like a double agent, sometimes a friend, sometimes a foe.
Yeah, I like that. It all depends on the specific strain, you know? Like which version of E. coli we're dealing with.
Okay, that makes sense. What about Staphylococcus aureus? That one sounds kind of intimidating.
Staphylococcus aureus, or staph for short, it's another common one, can cause a whole bunch of different infections. It actually lives on our skin and our noses normally. But if it gets inside the body through a cut or something, that's when it becomes a problem.
So it's like waiting for an opportunity to strike. I'm looking at the chart and I see there's MSSA and MRSA. What's the difference there?
Right. So MSSA, that stands for methicillin-sensitive Staphylococcus aureus, meaning it's susceptible to methicillin and other antibiotics like it. MRSA, on the other hand, that's methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. That's the superbug we were talking about earlier. Resistant to a lot of common antibiotics makes it much tougher to treat. Right,
so MSSA is like the regular villain, and MRSA is the supervillain with extra defenses.
Perfect analogy. Okay, so moving on. We've got Streptococcus bacteria. Those are the ones that cause strep throat, scarlet fever, some types of pneumonia.
Ooh, strep throat. I remember having that as a kid. Not fun.
Nope. Definitely not a good time. And then there's Enterococcus. Those often hang out in the gut, can cause UTIs, wound infections, even endocarditis, which is an infection of the heart valves.
Wow, so they can cause some serious damage.
Yeah, they can. And just like Staph aureus, Enterococcus has strains that have become resistant to multiple antibiotics, which makes treatment, more challenging.
Okay, so those are some of the main bacterial baddies on this chart. What about these, listed under gram-negative stavin?
Ah, yeah. Gram-negative stavin, that's Dutch for gram-negative rods. It's a category of bacteria with a certain structure to their cell walls in this group. It includes some real troublemakers, pathogens that can cause a variety of infections.
So it's like a whole gang of bacterial villains.
You got it. For example, we've got Klebsiella species, can cause pneumonia, UTIs, bloodstream infections, Proteus mirabilis, often associated with UTIs and wound infections.
Yeah.
And then there's Pseudomonas aeruginosa. That one's pretty common in hospitals, hospital-acquired infections. And it can be really hard to treat.
So hospitals can be kind of a breeding ground for these tougher bacteria.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's true. A lot of sick people, antibiotics being used all the time. It creates kind of the perfect conditions for these resistant bacteria to spread.
That's a little unsettling. Okay, what about the ones under anaerobin?
Anaerobin, that means anaerobes. So bacteria that thrive in environments without oxygen. They're often found in the gut, mouth, other areas of the body where there's not a lot of oxygen.
So they're like the rebels, hiding out in those oxygen-free zones.
I like it. One example is Bacteroides fragilis, common in the gut, usually harmless there, but if it gets out into other parts of the body, it can cause infections like abscesses, peritonitis.
Okay, so we've met a lot of bacterial bad guys. Let's get back to the chart and talk about how these antibiotics actually match up against them. How do we know which antibiotic to use against which bacteria?
Right. So remember that shading on the chart. That's our visual guide. Darker the shade, better chance the antibiotic will work.
Right. So, for example, I'm seeing meropenem. Looks like it has those nice dark shades against most of the bacteria listed, except for MSSA. Why is that?
Good observation. So meropenem, that's a broad-spectrum antibiotic, belongs to a class called carbapenems, known for being effective against a wide range of bacteria, including those gram-negative rods we talked about.
So it's like a multi-purpose weapon against those tough bacteria. But why does it struggle with MSSA?
Well, MSSA, sometimes it can produce these enzymes called beta-lactamases. They actually break down certain antibiotics, including some in that carbapenem class, like meropenem, so it makes them less effective.
Those sneaky enzymes are at it again. It's a constant battle of wits between the antibiotics and the bacteria.
It really is, and it highlights why antibiotic stewardship is so important. If we overuse antibiotics or misuse them, we're basically giving the bacteria more chances to evolve to develop resistance.
Yeah. I'm seeing the bigger picture now. It's not just about picking the right antibiotic, it's also about using them wisely so we don't accidentally create more supervillains.
Exactly. Now let's look at another example, clindamycin. That one seems to be a little more picky in its targets. Darker shades mainly against Staphylococcus, Streptococcus, and the anaerobes.
So it's more of a specialist, focusing on those particular types of bacteria.
Right. Often used for skin infections, bone infections, certain types of pneumonia.
Now there's this interesting note here about coagulus-negative Staphylococci, or CNS. It says they can often be treated with the same antibiotics as Staph aureus, but sensitivity needs to be tested first. Why is that?
That's a good catch. So CNS, that's a group of bacteria that are closely related to Staph aureus, but they can have different susceptibility patterns to antibiotics.
So even though they're related, they might have different weaknesses. That's fascinating.
It is. And it highlights how important personalized medicine is, especially when it comes to bacterial infections. We can't just assume one antibiotic will work for all bacteria, even if they seem similar.
Okay, that makes sense. We need to know the enemy before we can choose the right weapon. Now, before we move on, can we talk a bit more about antibiotic stewardship? You've mentioned it a couple times, and I think it's really important for our listeners to really understand what that means.
Of course. Antibiotic stewardship, it's all about using antibiotics wisely, responsibly, making sure they stay effective for as long as possible.
So it's not just on the doctors, it's on all of us to do our part.
Exactly. It means things like only using antibiotics when they're really needed, picking the right antibiotic for the specific infection, taking the full course of antibiotics as prescribed even if you start feeling better before you're done, and preventing infections in the first place. Good hygiene, vaccinations, all that.
Okay, so it's a multi-pronged approach to keeping those antibiotics working. I think that's a great place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground, explored the different antibiotics on this chart, the bacteria they target. So we were talking about antibiotic stewardship and how important that is, and for keeping those antibiotics effective, those lifesavers.
Yeah, absolutely. We all got to do our part to use them wisely. Doctors, patients, everyone.
Okay, let's get back to our chart. Explore some more of those pairings, like Piperacillin tazobactam. We talked about it being broad spectrum, but it has trouble with Enterococcus.
Right. So Enterococcus, those species, they've got these intrinsic resistance mechanisms to certain beta-lactams like piperacillin. They've basically evolved ways to modify their penicillin-binding proteins, which are what those drugs target. So by changing those proteins, they make it harder for piperacillin to bind and do its thing, disrupt the cell wall synthesis.
It's amazing how these tiny little organisms have developed these such sophisticated defenses. It's like a microscopic arms race, constantly escalating.
It really is. Bacteria have had billions of years to evolve and adapt, and they're really good at it. Survival, that's their game.
Okay, let's look at another one. Cefazolin. We mentioned that it's more limited in its effectiveness, mainly against gram-positive bacteria.
Right. Cefazolin, first-generation cephalosporin, primarily active against gram-positives like Staphylococcus, Streptococcus, surgical prophylaxis, skin infections, that's where it shines.
So a targeted weapon.
Right.
Against those specific types of bacteria.
Exactly. And that narrower spectrum, it's because of how it works, its mechanism, and also its susceptibility to certain bacterial enzymes. Those enzymes can break it down.
Those pesky enzymes, they're at it again. It seems like bacteria have a whole arsenal of weapons to use against antibiotics.
They do. They're tricky for sure.
What about amoxicillin combined with clavulanate? That one looks pretty effective against a lot of the gram-negatives.
Yeah, that combination. It's a smart way to get around bacterial resistance. So amoxicillin, broad spectrum, clavulanate, that's the beta-lactamase inhibitor. By putting them together, you basically disarm the bacteria's defense mechanism, let amoxicillin do its job.
It's like sending in a decoy to distract the enemy while the main force attacks. I like that. So this combo, often used when doctors suspect gram-negatives are involved, ear infections, sinus infections, things like that.
Yep, that's right. It extends amoxicillin's reach, makes it more effective, especially against those tricky gram-negatives.
Okay, how about gentamicin and tobramycin? They seem to work pretty well against a variety of bacteria.
Gentamicin, tobramycin, both aminoglycosides. They interfere with protein synthesis in bacteria, so that gives them a broad spectrum of activity, gram-positives, gram-negatives. But as we mentioned before, they can have some pretty serious side effects, so we got to be cautious with those.
Right, the heavy artillery of the antibiotic world. Powerful, but got to handle with care. Now, I'm noticing metronidazole again. It really seems to have a specific target, mainly H. influenza.
Metronidazole, yeah, it's kind of in a category of its own. It works against anaerobes, some parasites too. It messes with their DNA synthesis. And like you said, H. influenza, that's a common target, especially for respiratory tract infections.
Sounds like a sniper going after that one specific enemy. And then we have trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole, or COT.
COT, yep. Another combination antibiotic. This one targets the bacterial folate synthesis pathway, which is essential for them to grow. So you block that pathway. The bacteria can't grow, they die off. Used for UTIs, skin infections, certain types of pneumonia.
Wow, so cutting off the enemy's supply lines. We've learned a lot today. From penicillin to QT, we've explored how antibiotics battle these different bacteria. And this Dutch chart, it's been such a helpful guide, seeing those connections between the antibiotics and the bacteria they target.
It's been a real deep dive into the microbial world. We've seen how diverse antibiotics are, how they work, their mechanisms, and we've learned about how bacteria try to resist them. All of this really shows how important it is to use antibiotics responsibly, and it highlights how important personalized medicine is. And of course, we always need to keep researching, developing new antibiotics. It's a constant race against those evolving bacteria.
Totally. This knowledge helps us all make better decisions about using antibiotics. And it gives us a new appreciation for that intricate dance between antibiotics and bacteria.
Absolutely. Understanding that balance and working to preserve the effectiveness of these amazing drugs, that's what it's all about.
So how about a little quiz to test your antibiotic knowledge? Ready to see what you've learned?
Hit me with it. I'm ready.
All right, 10 questions. Here we go. Question 1. Which antibiotic is considered a last resort for treating MRSA?
Oh.
Question 2. What does ESBL stand for?
Got it.
Question 3. True or false? Ciprofloxacin works by inhibiting protein synthesis in bacteria. Question 4. Which type of bacteria is commonly associated with urinary tract infections?
All right.
Question 5. What does the darker shading on the antibiotic chart indicate?
Okay.
Question 6. What's the main difference between MSSA and MRSA?
All right.
Question 7. True or false? All strains of E. coli are harmful.
Okay.
Question 8. Which two antibiotics on the chart work by interfering with bacterial DNA replication.
Got it.
Question 9, what's one strategy to combat bacterial enzymes that break down beta-lactam antibiotics?
Okay.
And question 10, what are 2 important aspects of antibiotic stewardship?
All right. Let's see how you did. Here are the answers. Answer 1, vancomycin.
That's right.
Answer 2, extended spectrum beta-lactamase.
Correct.
Answer 3, false. Ciprofloxacin inhibits bacterial DNA replication.
Good catch.
Answer 4, E. coli.
That's right.
Answer 5, higher chance of the antibiotic being effective against that bacteria.
Correct.
Answer 6, MSSA is susceptible to methicillin while MRSA is resistant.
You got it.
Answer 7, false. Most strains of E. coli are harmless and live in our intestines.
That's right.
Answer 8, ciprofloxacin and metronidazole.
All right.
Answer 9, combining antibiotics with beta-lactamase inhibitors.
That's right.
And answer 10, any 2 of the following. Using antibiotics only when necessary, choosing the right antibiotic for the specific infection, taking the full course of antibiotics as prescribed, and preventing infections through good hygiene and vaccinations.
Wow, great job. How did you do? We hope you aced this antibiotic quiz.
It's been fun talking about all this with you. Remember, the more we understand about antibiotics and how they work against bacteria, the better we can use them responsibly and protect ourselves from infection.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the antibiotic spectrum. We'll see you next time. Keep learning, stay curious.